I just wanted to make this video going over some problems I was having with Blender and getting game ready rigs sort of imported into Unreal Engine or other software. Now, while I was having these problems, I was looking online and I couldn't really find anyone asking similar questions, and I definitely couldn't find any good answers to it. So after a while, I've sort of found out that the main problem is with Blender's FBX exporter. If you've got a sort of rig that's sort of fully done, it's all ready to go in Engine, you might just use the usual export settings, which would just be selected objects, armature and mesh, negative Y forwards, face, turn off leaf bones, and because I'm just doing the rig, I'm not gonna have any animations. So you normally just export this into Engine. And for the most part, that works. If you just drag it out into the scene, it's all the correct scale, everything's the correct size. If you go in here, it all looks normal, but when you start clicking through the bones, you notice that the bones are absolutely massive, and if we turn them on, you can see the bones are way too big. And you might just say, well, you can turn the draw size down, and yeah, that looks normal, it looks fixed, but it doesn't actually change any of the data. If we go into the skeleton here, you can see the scale is set to 1 on all these bones here, which is correct, it's meant to be 1. But the moment we go to the root bone, that's set to 100, and that's where the sort of main issue lies. If you are just doing basic animations and you've got your sort of your animation set up over here and you just have it plugged into the input pose, it should work fine. You've got the animations working, it all looks fine, it should play completely fine. And some physics things will also work. So if you want to add sort of spring or jiggle physics to the character, then you just plug these in and you can see the character bounces around, it all works fine. But the moment you want to add either a socket or any rigid body physics, if you go into here, rigid body physics in Unreal Engine are the type of things you'd use for sort of long chains of hair, or if the character has any equipment on, or a sword or a rifle, and you want that to sort of bounce around while they're moving. So this character here has got some tendrils, and they're going to sort of wave behind him and bounce along as he's bouncing along. So we've got the setup in the physics asset, all the constraints, everything set up properly. But we plug this into the rigid body, the animation blueprint, with standard settings, so correct physics asset, negative 980 for gravity, usual settings here, base bone space is the usual one you use, hit compile, and it just completely explodes. It goes absolutely everywhere, and that's not what you're looking for. So you might think the solution is to change it to world space or component space, but that just does the exact opposite. It just shrinks it down 100 times, and now you can't really see anything. The other issue with this is if you wanted to add a socket to anything, just put a socket in his elbow, it doesn't really matter. And we go to this cube here. The moment we add that, it's going to scale the cube up 100 times. So that is also going to be an absolutely massive cube because it's being scaled up 100 times because of that root bone. Now, the reason that the root bone is scaled up 100 times is to do with Blender's FBX exporter. So FBX file format is actually an Autodesk sort of proprietary format. It's their software format. There's not really much point in creating a file format that only your software can use and nothing else is compatible with, because you can make a very nice rig, it can be game ready in Maya, and then you try and export it to Unreal Engine and it just sort of doesn't work. So what they've done is they've distributed the FBX importer, so Unreal Engine and I'm sure Unity and Blender's importers, like first party, that's all official. But the exporter on Blender at least is third party, and for the most part it works completely fine. But there's one little scale setting that for some reason scales the root bone up to, I think it's a scale of 1. Everything else uses a scale of 0.01, I was told, and Blender uses 1. Now, I don't know if this also has something to do with it, but the way you make rigs in Blender, I find quite annoying. Normally when you're making a rig, you just create a bone, and then you just extrude off that, or you just make multiple bones and connect them up in the hierarchy, and that'd be fine. And the first bone you'd create would be the root bone at 0, 0, 0, just here. But when you're doing it in Blender, you create an armature. Now, an armature in Blender is not a bone. An armature is the thing representing the entire rig. So you've got like the animation information here, and you've got the actual bone here, right? So when you're making a rig, you kind of assume this bone should be the root bone. But when you're actually coming to export it, Blender says, actually, no, this armature here, this is actually the root bone. So if you make a actual root bone and export it, you'll end up with two root bones, one of which does nothing, and this one here, which actually does something. It doesn't matter what you call this, it doesn't matter what names you change, this will always be the root bone when you export it. I don't know if there's a setting to change that. That might fix these issues, I've no idea. But I've not found a way to export a rig without this armature becoming the root. So while I was working on this project, I sort of spoke to my tech artist at the time, and he was the one that told me all this. He tried a bunch of these other different file formats. USD, he was able to get the mesh and rig exported into Engine with USD, but not the animations, so we kind of had to stick with FBX. So I'm sure there are some other workarounds of this. I know you can use Maya. If you do use Maya or 3ds Max or other, or like official Autodesk software, you should not have this problem at all. And I don't know if there's any Blender plugins. I've not found any. I've done a little bit of searching. There's probably one that costs about 500 quid to fix this, but I've not found any good plugins or any other interesting or easier ways of getting this working. So my workaround for it is keep the large version of this character here that's sort of kind of broken, and you want to select all the same things again, make sure everything's exactly the same as it was, export, keep the settings exactly as they were before, only this time you just need to change two things. So apply scaling, set that to FBX unit scaled, and apply transform. Now just give this a different name so you know which one's which, export that. Then when you import it into Engine, you'll get these three here. You get a new skeletal mesh, a new skeleton, new physics asset. Something else to note is that when you're exporting something from Blender or importing it to Unreal Engine using the FBX file format, because the sort of big character's root bone was scaled up 100 times, and because this new one's scaled down 100 times to be 1, you might be tempted to change the scale some way. You might want to put this at 100 or something, but the problem that creates is it also just scales the bone right back up. So if we go back into the skeleton, all these are set to 1, but the root bone is still set to 100, which kind of just defeats the entire purpose of changing those two settings, as they both fix this. Now, immediately you can probably tell it's a bit of a problem. It's very, very small, and that is a bit of a problem, but there's another sort of smaller workaround for that. If we go to the skeleton for this thing, you can see relative to its size, it's still quite big, but for an actual rig, that's fine. All the scales are still set to 1, and the root bone this time is also set to 1, which means everything will work. All the physics stuff you want will work, all the sockets will work, it'll all be fine. You might say, well, I've got to remake my physics asset now, and not really, because the fact it's so small kind of creates another issue, and that's these it's very hard to make a physics asset at this scale. If you get close to it, it just kind of vanishes into the camera. And you can see, like, if you're trying to do any of the constraints, they're absolutely massive. Like, good luck working with that. So what I would say is just delete this physics asset, go to the big physics asset you created, drag that into the folder with your small character, and in the skeletal mesh of the small character, just scroll down to asset details and just change this physics asset to be the big one. And as long as the skeleton's the same, this should be fully compatible. So once you've done that, if we go to the animation blueprint of this, we can see we've got this rigid body node that has the exact same settings created. It's all the same. If we go to the third person character, just turn the visibility of this off first. Change this to be our small character and change this to be the animation blueprint for the small character. You can see he's there and he's absolutely tiny, so we've got to scale him up 100 times. And there he is. So if we hit play, you can see now the physics works on the head and it's flopping about fine. I mean, some of the values are a little bit off, it's just a prototype, so it doesn't really matter. But we can see that's actually working now. So that's sort of my workaround for it. Socket should work fine. Yeah, if you know any other better ways of doing it, because this is a bit annoying, it leaves you with two versions of the character, one of which you shouldn't use. and another one of which is absolutely tiny. But it's a workaround for vanilla Blender and vanilla Unreal Engine, no plugins or anything like that. It should work fine for most people. If you know any other workarounds or anything else you can do, please just put something in the comments. That would be great. And I hope this helps somebody at some point. Thank you.